I was locked in a sweltering room under a tin roof, windowless inside the very house that bears my name. While they went on vacation posting smiling selfies, I lay curled up listening to their laughter through walls, counting the days until they'd ship me off to a care home. But then, I made them pay with the last symphony I wrote in fury. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you won't miss our next haunting films. The metal above her head popped and creaked with the rising sun. Each morning began with this strange music, the roof expanding under the heat, complaining softly in the language of rust and tension. Mavis Laney opened her eyes to that familiar symphony, her skin already damp beneath the thin cotton sheets. The air was still trapped in this little triangle of space that used to be an attic now retrofitted with plasterboard, and a single oscillating fan that hadn't worked right since last summer. She blinked into the dust-streaked light leaking through the vent slats on the far wall. No window, just walls that once held suitcases and winter coats now holding her. The ceiling sloped too low for her to stand upright at the edges. She moved carefully, her joints stiff from the heat and age. Her hands, once elegant and fluid on the piano keys, now trembled slightly as she reached for her glasses on the crate that served as a nightstand. The house below stirred faintly footsteps, doors opening and closing. Celia's sharp voice echoed up the air duct, as if carried by a megaphone, followed by the deeper controlled murmur of Dr. Howard Laney, her daughter and son-in-law. They spoke freely, assuming the woman under the tin roof couldn't hear them, but she heard everything. She always had. Mavis sat up, brushed a curl of silver hair from her forehead, and slowly reached for the glass of water on the floor. Warm. She drank it anyway. Then she looked toward the far wall where her old upright piano stood. Well, not really stood. It crouched against the back beam like an embarrassed guest at a funeral. The keys were chipped. A few stuck when you pressed them, but it still sang if you knew how to ask. Each night after the house had gone to sleep, Mavis would sit on the stool she'd fashioned out of a garden bucket and play, softly. Pieces she remembered from the days when her fingers flew through Mozart and Chopin like birds in wind. Lately she played only pieces that could be whispered. Fragments, memory songs, her lullabies to herself. What she didn't know, what she hadn't allowed herself to hope, was that someone was listening. Not inside the house, of course. Celia found music cluttered. Howard had suggested more than once that at her age Mavis ought to embrace quiet mindfulness. They'd gutted the music room 5 years ago and installed a meditation space with a sauna and a mirror wall. The piano had been saved only because Mavis had wept quietly, shamefully in front of the movers. Now it lived with her under the roof, as forgotten as the woman who played it. But outside the house, just beyond the tall shrubs and the carefully trimmed hedges that framed the garden, Noah waited. He came each evening barefoot with a spiral notebook and a flashlight. He sat cross-legged on the ground back against the fence palms flat on the earth, his eyes closed, body still, as if waiting for something sacred to begin. He didn't hear the notes, not in the way most people did. He was born without hearing his world built on light and vibration, the shape of people's mouths, the movement of air. But the piano, oh, the piano, he could feel that. The floor shivered beneath him when she played low octaves. The treble keys danced across the soles of his feet, and when she played certain chords complex and full, it felt like standing under a sky that hummed. Noah never told anyone about the woman under the roof. It was his secret, this music no one else believed in. At school he wrote in essays about the invisible concert he attended every night, and teachers smiled awkwardly and wrote notes to his parents about imagination. But it wasn't imagination. The old woman was real. Her music was real. It was the only thing that ever made him feel less alone. Back upstairs, Mavis reached for the small notebook she kept tucked under her mattress. She flipped it open, staring at a page of slanted handwriting. Tuesday scales in F minor. Noah again. Maybe. She tapped her pencil against the margin. Sometimes she thought she was imagining the shape outside the fence. Sometimes she feared she wasn't. She sighed and pushed herself up from the mattress. The floorboards groaned in protest. She shuffled toward the back corner where a small mirror hung from a bent nail. Her reflection met her there, soft, aged eyes lined with quiet hunger. This was not how she imagined her retirement. She had been a teacher. For 30 years she had shaped children's hands into confidence and rhythm. She had led school concerts, guided parents to tears with Christmas performances, stayed late with kids who wanted one more try. Now she was invisible, folded neatly away into the roof of the house she'd paid for, and they'd called it kindness. "It's just for a while," Mom Celia had said that day with the blueprints on the kitchen table. "We need the space downstairs for clients. But look, we insulated the attic. It'll be cozy." Cozy. Mavis glanced at the thermometer nailed to the beam, 94 degrees Fahrenheit. At 7:05 a.m., she dressed quickly. Simple linen dress, orthopedic sandals. She moved carefully to the piano, lifting the cloth cover, revealing keys like yellowed teeth. She didn't play. Not yet. Not during the day. That was the unspoken rule. Downstairs she heard the clatter of breakfast. The scent of grilled vegetables and lemon tea floated up through the cracks. Her stomach growled. No one had brought her a plate in weeks. The kitchen was for clients now, Howard had said so. She kept a small fridge in the crawl space under the eaves, stocked with apples and prepackaged yogurt. From the floor vent, voices drifted again. "We need to finalize the paperwork before we leave," Howard said, his tone clipped. Celia's voice. "She's not going to sign it. She's suspicious. She's not going to do anything. She barely leaves that attic. We'll say it's for her benefit, that we're helping her manage things. She's old, she'll fold." The sound of forks scraping plates, ice clinking in glasses. Mavis backed away from the vent, her heart thudding. The walls of the attic felt closer now, too near. She sat back on the mattress, staring at the vent like it might grow teeth. They were planning something. She'd known it deep in her bones in the way they spoke to her, like she was a child in the new lawyer's letters with too many words and not enough answers. But now she'd heard it, and she wasn't imagining that. Outside in the side yard, Noah sat on his usual spot, eyes half closed, hands against the earth. He didn't know what had changed in the air, only that tonight the music would be different. It would be the beginning of something neither of them could name yet. But it was coming, and it would begin beneath a roof of thin, sweating metal, where the world had tucked away a woman it thought was finished, and where she quietly was beginning again. The hallway was already buzzing with activity when Mavis stepped down the attic ladder. She moved slowly, cautious not to slip on the polished wood floor. It was the only time of day she allowed herself to come down early morning before the house became someone else's domain. She headed straight to the kitchen. The light was warm through the bay windows, glinting off marble countertops and chrome appliances that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Her old wooden cabinets, the ones Barton had carved, were gone. So was the small breakfast nook where she used to sip tea and read the paper. It was now a juice bar stocked with imported honey bone broth packets and mason jars filled with ground things that smelled vaguely like mulch. Mavis opened the fridge and reached for her yogurt. Behind her heels clicked sharply across the tile. "Mom." Celia's voice clipped and tight like a phone call she didn't want to make. "The Holbrooks are coming at 9. Please don't hang around the kitchen this morning." Mavis turned slowly. "I'm just getting breakfast." "I know, but you know how our clients are. They expect serenity, not distractions." "Distractions." Celia didn't flinch. "The detox session is very energy-focused, and you, well, sometimes you shuffle." The word struck harder than expected. Shuffle. Like a sad cartoon. Like a woman with nowhere to go. "I'll be quick. No rush," Celia said, already stepping back. "Just maybe head upstairs once you're done. And please rinse the juicer when you're finished. Howard hates the smell." Mavis gave a short nod and turned back to the fridge. She took her yogurt and apple and the last of the almond crackers from the shelf labeled neutral zone, the only part of the fridge she was welcome to touch. Her name wasn't on the label, but she understood the boundaries. Celia's footsteps disappeared into the living room, where candles were already burning and soothing music played from the speakers. Mavis looked around the kitchen. It was once hers. She knew every pipe under the sink, every creak in the floor near the pantry door. Now it looked like a magazine spread, sterile, staged, nothing left of the life she once cooked in. She cleaned up quickly. Her hands, though slow, were practiced. She rinsed her things, wiped the counters, even cleaned the juicer she hadn't used. It wasn't about being helpful anymore. It was about not being in the way. By 8:15, she was back upstairs, sitting near the vent, listening. She could hear them now. Howard greeting the Holbrooks with his buttery voice, his words warm but weightless. This space used to be completely wasted, he was saying. Old storage room. But we saw the potential. Minimalist, sustainable, restorative. Laughter. Then Celia. We took inspiration from Japanese micro-retreats. Everything intentional, every object meaningful. Even the scent profile is custom blended. Lovely, Mrs. Holbrook gushed. I feel calmer just stepping inside. Wait till you see Howard's office, Celia added. It's his sanctuary. Mavis closed her eyes. That office used to be hers. It had once been a music room lined with books and sheet music, with a wide window that overlooked the garden. She taught private lessons there. Children came after school with their clumsy scales and their nervous hands. There had been so much laughter in that room, so many beginnings. Now it was bamboo walls and glass desks. Now it smelled like bergamot and CBD oil. Later, after the Holbrooks left, and the scent of frankincense had thinned from the air, Mavis crept downstairs again. The house was quiet. Celia had gone to meet clients downtown. Howard presumably was at the hospital. She needed to check the mail. Not hers, of course. But once in a while an envelope slipped through a letter from a former student, a statement from her pension account, something with her name on it. She reached for the basket near the door and sifted quickly. Junk mail, catalogs, a letter from an estate agency, and one from Lucerne Senior Living Solutions. She froze. The envelope was addressed to Dr. Howard Laney, inside a brochure. She didn't need to open it to know. Her hands trembled as she tucked the envelope back, careful to leave no trace. She backed away from the door slowly, like a thief heart thudding in her ears. She needed tea, something warm, something steady. She stepped into the kitchen, reached for the kettle, and turned to the stove. That's when she saw it, the small black square by the corner of the counter. It was newer than everything else, sleek, modern, blinking. A voice recorder. The light was still on. She touched it. It was warm. She looked around, then pressed play. The recording began with the rustle of papers. Howard's voice came first. Once she's in, we can start the transfer. Celia, she'll need to sign off. She won't know what she's signing. She never reads them. We'll say it's for her health insurance, just a routine update. A pause. Celia and the house. We put it in the trust. After 30 days, it's ours. She'll have everything she needs at Lucerne. Nurses, meals, medication. She'll be better off. She won't be happy. She's not happy now. A long silence. Then Celia, again quieter. I don't want her to feel abandoned. Howard chuckled. She won't have time to feel anything. She'll be too busy with bingo and pudding cups. Click. The recording ended. Mavis stared at the counter. A part of her went very still. Another part, one that had once stood in front of a choir of 90 children and made them believe they could sing that part, began to hum. She moved slowly, deliberately, and unplugged the device. She slipped it into her dress pocket. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just boiled her water, made her tea, and carried it back upstairs one step at a time. Inside the attic, she sat down on her bed and stared at the walls. They were planning to erase her, to remove her like clutter, to take the house she'd bought with Barton, the house where she'd raised Celia, the house with the garden she'd once danced barefoot through during thunderstorms. Now they wanted her gone, but not yet. They didn't know she'd heard. They didn't know she'd felt the earthquake beneath their words. She reached beneath her mattress and pulled out her notebook. She opened to a fresh page. She didn't write a plan. She didn't know what to write yet. But she did write a single line at the top of the page. They think I'm done. And below that, I'm not. Outside, the sun beat down on the tin roof, filling the attic with heat and tension. Mavis sat still, listening to the creaks and groans of the metal. Each pop was a pulse, each crack a breath. Somewhere down the street, Noah stood by the fence palms on the wood waiting. He didn't know what was coming, but she did. It had already begun. The tightness started in her chest by late afternoon, like someone had pressed a fist against her sternum and left it there. Mavis sat upright on the edge of her narrow bed under the sloped ceiling, one hand clutching the fabric of her dress, the other pressed to her chest, steadying herself. Sweat trickled down her spine. The heat under the tin roof was unbearable, but this was different, deeper pulsing, urgent. She tried to breathe to stay calm. It had been years since her last episode. She remembered how Howard had once insisted she just needed hydration. That was before they moved her into the attic, before the conversations she wasn't meant to hear. The pain didn't subside, but it didn't peak either. It hovered like a wasp waiting. She didn't tell anyone. She knew exactly what would happen if she did. A trip to the ER followed by recommendations, evaluations, tests. Maybe she needs more structured care, Howard would say. Maybe a facility. The very word they'd used in that recording, Lucerne. So she stayed silent. She took small sips of water, lay down for 15 minutes, then sat back up and stared at the recorder in her lap. The same device they'd used to plan her disappearance. Now hers. She stared at the blinking red light, then carefully rewound the tape to the start of a fresh section. It was already half full from their earlier conversation. She wasn't sure what she was doing yet, only that she needed to have something proof leverage anything. Her heart still thudded unnaturally. She slipped the recorder into her apron pocket and quietly made her way down the attic ladder. She didn't call out. She walked like a ghost. The living room was empty, dim in the golden hour. The air smelled like mint oil and filtered air. The hall beyond was open, leading to the kitchen. She could hear Celia's voice before she even rounded the corner. "She doesn't eat half of what we buy, it's a waste," Howard's voice replied, flat, tired. "We'll sort it. Just give me the paperwork." "Do you think we should wait until after the retreat?" "No. The listing agent is ready. If we can present everything in one go, she won't have a leg to stand on. And the medical power of attorney. Drafted. She signs we're in the clear. The house gets transferred to the trust, then Lucerne. They handle everything after that." Mavis had stopped just short of the archway. She could see them, Celia, on the bar stool, legs crossed, sipping from a green glass. Howard at the counter with his laptop open. Her fingers trembled in her apron pocket. She pressed record. The tiny red light came on. "I still feel bad," Celia said softer now. "It's not like she's completely senile." Howard looked up. "She doesn't need to be. She just needs to be inconvenient. People like her, they fade. You don't push them out, you let the wind do the work." Celia said nothing. Howard went on. "You saw how she clutched her chest yesterday. We'll say it's stress. That Lucerne is a precaution." Mavis's knees weakened. She pressed her back to the wall for support. They'd seen, they'd noticed, and still they plotted. Still they smiled while they did it. She stepped backward as quietly as possible, retreating down the hall. Her breath came shorter now. The recorder burned in her hand. In the attic, she shut the hatch and leaned against the wall. It was darker now. The sun had dipped below the neighbor's house, casting longer shadows. Her fingers trembled as she placed the recorder beside her pillow. She sat on the floor trying to quiet her heart. It wasn't working. Not the fear, not the heat, not the rage. None of it would quiet. So she stood, moved to the piano, lifted the cloth. She sat, and she played. Not the lullabies, not the soft nocturnes. Tonight she chose something else. A piece by Rachmaninoff. Dark, aching, full of unresolved chords and crashing bass. She didn't care if the keys stuck. She didn't care if Celia heard. The attic filled with storm. The sound escaped through the cracks in the vents, through the walls, through the boards under her feet. Down the block, Noah looked up from his usual place beneath the hedge. He had been about to leave, but the sound rooted him. It was different tonight. Not a whisper, not a prayer, a cry. He scrambled up, palms pressed to the garden bed, feet braced against the dirt, eyes closed. The vibrations were stronger than ever, even from here. It rolled under the soil and through the wood and into his chest like thunder. He smiled. He lifted his hand, and he clapped. A single strong beat, then another. Upstairs, Mavis heard it. Not the sound exactly, but the rhythm of it, the pulse beneath her hands like a mirror coming back through the keys. She stopped, listened. The silence was deep. Then she moved to the attic's narrow back window, the one they'd covered with mesh to keep the birds out. She pulled aside the curtain, stared through the screen into the yard below. And there he was. The boy. She saw him clearly now, pale, wiry, kneeling beside the fence, a notebook in his lap, a flashlight tucked under his chin. His eyes were wide locked on her like she was the last light on a stormy sea. She didn't know his name, but she had seen him before. The boy in the yard, always there at dusk, always waiting. She moved closer to the screen. He stood up slowly, lifted both hands, and signed. She didn't know the language, but she understood. He pointed to his heart, then tapped the air, then pointed to her. Her throat closed. She raised her hand, palm open, fingers slightly curled. She smiled. He smiled back. Then he pulled something from his bag, a candle in a glass jar. He lit it, held it up to the fence. She watched the flame flicker, casting light on his face. She picked up her own bedside candle, carried it to the window, lit it with shaking hands, and held it up in return. Two flames facing each other across the dark. No words, no sound. But in the silence, something passed between them. A message, a promise. You are not invisible. You are not alone. Downstairs, Howard opened the back door and called out, "What are you doing out here?" Noah startled. He blew out the candle and took a step back. "I said, what are you doing?" Howard repeated. But Noah was already moving, slipping through the side yard like a shadow. Mavis dropped behind the curtain. She returned to the piano. Her fingers found the keys again. This time she played softer. But not for the house, not for herself, for him. Outside the street was still, but the garden still held the echo of applause. And the attic, once suffocating, once silent, was now full of breath. The door had opened, and it would not close again. The next morning, Mavis found the note tucked into the crack beneath the back garden gate. Folded twice, the paper was soft and smudged from damp fingers, but the handwriting was deliberate, slanted, neat, and young. She opened it carefully, heart fluttering in a way she hadn't felt in decades. "You play beautifully. I hear it with my hands, Noah. No name." But she knew. The boy from the fence, the candlelight, the clapping in the dark. Her fingers lingered on the page. There was something so gentle about it, so sure. The handwriting of someone who had waited a long time to be heard. She reread the sentence. "I hear it with my hands." Noah wasn't guessing. He wasn't pretending. He had been listening all along. And in that moment, the weight of her years in the attic, the bitter taste of being silenced, it all cracked slightly, like ice giving way beneath spring water. She tucked the note into her pocket and kept it with her all day, touching it like a talisman whenever the house tightened around her again. Celia passed her 3 times without a glance. Howard asked her to move her drying laundry from the sunroom because he had a Zoom with donors. But none of it stung the way it usually did, because someone had hurt her. That night she returned to the attic with the note pressed under her pillow, and her heart strangely alive. At dusk she lit the candle by the attic window again. This time the boy was already waiting. He held up another paper, bigger this time, and written in black Sharpie. "My name is Noah." She nodded, her smile breaking through her usual stillness. She bent below the windowsill and wrote her own on the back of a crossword puzzle. "Mavis." She held it up. Noah gave a small bow. Then he pulled something from his bag, a worn pair of gloves with holes at the fingertips. He tapped his chest, pointed to his ears, then made a small cross with his fingers over his mouth. Mavis leaned in, watching. He held up another sign. "I was born deaf, been this way forever." Then another. "But I feel music, like storms in my bones." Mavis felt a laugh build in her chest, one of disbelief, of reverence. She nodded slowly and brought her hands to her chest. She didn't need signs for this part. She understood. He slid a new note under the fence the next day. This time she didn't find it by accident. He waited on the other side, fingers drumming against the dirt, until he saw her silhouette appear by the garden. She opened the envelope slowly. It held a single folded page, lined notebook paper. This one was longer. "They won't let me take music at school. The principal says it's not realistic. They think I just want to make noise. They don't understand I'm not trying to hear music. I'm trying to hold it. I want to know how it works. But no one wants to teach a deaf kid how to feel a piano. They think I should join woodshop." Her throat tightened as she read the words. She pressed the page to her chest and closed her eyes. She had taught hundreds of children, some of them shy, some wild, some broken quietly in ways their parents couldn't see. But none of them had asked for music like this. None of them had ever described it as something they wanted to hold. That night she waited for him by the garden fence. When he approached, he looked surprised, tentative. She held up her own note this time. "Come tomorrow. Back garden. 4 p.m. We try something." His eyes widened. He pointed to himself as if to say, "Me." She nodded, firm. He gave a wide grin, then spun once in the grass and bolted home like a child chasing summer. It had been so long since she had seen joy uncontained. It startled her. The next day she cleared the sunroom. Not Howard's new meditation space, he'd be gone all afternoon at a conference, but the space beside it still partially filled with old furniture. She wiped down her practice bench and moved the upright piano into the corner near the French doors. The weight of it strained her back, made her heart gallop in warning, but she didn't stop. By 3:45 she had everything ready. A shallow tray of rice, an old tambourine, a metronome, a printed picture of a piano keyboard, each note labeled, and her hands ready again after so many years. At 4:00 sharp he appeared, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the yard for her. She opened the side gate and beckoned him in. He entered like someone crossing into a dream, careful, hesitant breath held in. They sat together in silence for a moment, both unsure what this was becoming. She pointed to the tambourine first and motioned for him to place his hands on it. Then she struck a single low key on the piano, G2. The skin of the tambourine quivered under his palms. He looked at her, surprised. She did it again, C3. Again movement. Now 2 notes at once, then 3. She watched his breath change, watched his fingers lift as if to chase the vibration upward. He didn't smile. He focused, eyes locked on her hands. She moved next to the rice tray. She had once used this trick for young children learning rhythm. Now she placed his fingertips into the grains. She began to play simple scales, C major, slow, steady. The rice jumped with each note. Noah's eyes widened. He pressed deeper. He nodded, then reached into his backpack and pulled out his own paper. "This is what I wanted, not sound, this." She set down the rice tray, leaned in and reached for the printed keyboard chart. She tapped middle C, then played it on the piano. He watched her fingers, nodded. She tapped D. He followed. She moved to E, then paused, and let him try. His fingers hovered, uncertain, then pressed. Wrong note. She shook her head gently, tapped again. This time he found it, and the joy that bloomed across his face was a kind of miracle. They worked like that for nearly an hour. By the end, he could press 5 keys in order, one finger at a time, matching them to the chart. She guided his hands with hers, showed him how to feel the weight of the keys, how to release slowly, how to follow the metronome, even when he couldn't hear it. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He learned by watching, by touching, by remembering. She taught by gesture, by repetition, by instinct. When the lesson was over, he held up a sign from his notebook. "Can I come back tomorrow?" She nodded. He wrote another. "You don't think it's stupid?" She shook her head, then pointed to his hands, then to his chest, then back to the piano. The message was clear. This was music, too. He grinned again, slower this time, more sure of himself, and turned to leave. Mavis stood alone in the sunroom, the evening light catching her reflection in the window. Her face looked different, less faded, more real. The door to the past hadn't closed. Not yet. Not if she could still pass music from one set of hands to another. Not if the notes she'd carried for 70 years still had somewhere to land. Outside, the sky turned amber. Inside, the house was silent. But her fingers, those long, pale, trembling fingers, still remembered. And tomorrow they would play again. Working in secret required a kind of precision Mavis hadn't practiced in decades. Not since her teaching years. Not since she had to balance sheet music lesson plans and overbearing administrators, all while smiling through exhaustion. But this was different. This was survival. It began with a lie, a small one. "I'm heading to the pharmacy," she said that morning, grabbing her canvas bag. Celia didn't look up from her tablet. "Pick up almond milk if you're out. We're expecting guests for the detox retreat this weekend." Howard didn't bother acknowledging her at all. He was on the patio doing breathing exercises in front of the fountain he'd installed where her rose garden used to be. Mavis walked 5 blocks, turned the corner, and doubled back to the public library. The local branch had been modernized, quiet, cold, filled with self-service kiosks and disinterested volunteers. She bypassed the fiction aisles, ignoring the stares of students and retirees, and headed straight for the public use computers. It took her 3 tries to log in. The mouse was sticky, The screen flickered, but eventually she was in. She typed her own name into the county property records database. A simple search. Her fingers hovered. Lainey Mavis June, 61 Sycamore Avenue, title holder, sole owner. She froze, stared. It was still hers. The house, the land, the mortgage-free home she had built with her late husband. They hadn't transferred it. They hadn't sold it. She hadn't signed it away. She clicked to print. Pages whirred out. She slid them into her bag hand, trembling, heart beating like a small bird against its cage. Outside, she called someone she hadn't spoken to in 6 years. "Janice, it's Mavis." A pause, then warmth. "Well, I'll be damned. You still alive in that gingerbread coffin?" Mavis smiled faintly. "Barely. I need help, the kind you don't ask neighbors for." There was a silence on the other end, then Janice whispered, "Say no more. I've got someone." That someone arrived the next day, disguised as a woman browsing rare vinyl records in a downtown bookstore. Greta Harlan, 48, eyes sharp as razors, dressed in a tan trench coat that looked both expensive and completely forgettable. She didn't shake Mavis's hand. Instead, she nodded toward the back of the store and said simply, "Follow me." They sat in the corner cafe, steam rising from 2 untouched mugs of tea. Mavis opened her bag and slid across the documents. Property title. A crumpled envelope with the medical proxy Celia had left on her bed 3 weeks ago. Greta didn't speak as she scanned them. She pulled out a small flashlight to read the finer print. Then she closed the folder, her mouth a thin dark line. "They're bluffing," she said. "These papers are garbage. The medical power of attorney isn't notarized. No witness signatures. The phrasing isn't even state compliant." Mavis let out a breath so long and shaky it sounded like a lifetime escaping. "So they can't force me. They can try. They will try. But legally, you're standing on a mountain. They're on stilts." Greta leaned forward. Her voice dropped. "You want to fight this?" Mavis hesitated. And then for the first time in years, she said clearly, "Yes." "Good," Greta said. "Then we need to act like you're already free, but quietly. You can't tip them off. Not yet." They sketched out a plan. Greta would begin the process of securing Mavis's assets, locking down her deed, notifying the registrar's office that any future changes to the title required in-person authentication. She would help Mavis draft a new will, one that rerouted her estate towards something meaningful. "Do you have anyone you trust?" Greta asked. Mavis thought of Noah, his fingers on the tambourine, the way he mouthed thank you without a sound. She thought of his drawings, the notebook pages he left at the gate. "Yes," she said softly, "a boy, but he's just a child." Greta didn't smile, but her voice softened. Sometimes that's exactly the kind of witness the world listens to. Before they parted, Greta handed her a burner phone. Tiny, untraceable. "Text only," she said. "No calls. Hide it in a music book, one they'd never open." Mavis nodded. She knew the perfect one. Debussy, Clair de Lune. Back home, she resumed her role, the quiet one, the invisible one. Howard didn't notice the fire in her step. He was too busy planning his silent retreat. Celia didn't notice the lack of protest when she commandeered the guest room for a new sauna pod. But Noah noticed. That evening she met him by the fence again. This time she brought her own signs. "I'm working on something for us, for later." He tilted his head. She added, "We need to be careful, but trust me." He didn't ask questions. He just nodded and held up a new sign. "I trust the hands that taught me." That night, while the house was asleep, Mavis typed her first message to Greta from the burner phone. The light from the screen lit her face like the ghost of her former self. "Title secured. We'll draft tomorrow. What's next?" Greta's reply came instantly. "We shift the balance, quietly." And somewhere in the dark, the war began. Not a war of noise, not of explosions, but of quiet rebellions, whispered signatures, legal loopholes. It was a different kind of symphony, and this time Mavis would conduct it herself. The first thing Mavis did was unhook the curtain rod. She didn't need drapes in that sweltering attic crawl space anymore. She needed movement. She needed space. Every Friday morning, at precisely 8:45 a.m., Celia and Howard left the house for their ritualistic spa getaway, where they detoxed with volcanic clay and infrared saunas, and silence they had paid handsomely for. That gave Mavis 6 hours. 6 uninterrupted hours of freedom. She used them like a thief uses darkness. By week 2, she had quietly rearranged the furniture in her attic room, moved the cot closer to the wall, stacked her books in makeshift shelves along the beams, cleared a patch of floor for what she now called the circle. Noah was the first student. Then came Leah, 7 years old, partial hearing loss from a congenital condition. Her mother, a janitor at the clinic, agreed to drop her off for a few hours of art class, not needing to know the truth. Then Eli, 10, profoundly deaf but obsessed with rhythm. He never stopped drumming on surfaces. And finally, Myra, soft-spoken, hearing aids in both ears with a confidence that disappeared the second anyone raised their voice. They arrived one by one, all 3 of them filtering into the hidden room with backpacks and wary eyes, unsure why the old woman from the corner house wanted to see them, but curious enough not to ask. Mavis welcomed them with open palms and a warm smile, and music. She had converted her space in secret. Borrowed keyboards, makeshift percussion instruments made from old pots and rubber bands. She brought up her tambourine, her metronome, and even the wind chimes that once hung outside her classroom window decades ago. Noah stood at the doorway watching them enter. He didn't speak, but he smiled. He understood what was happening. Mavis gathered them in the circle and wrote on a large notepad, "We're going to listen, but not with our ears, with our skin, with our bones, with the space between us." She handed out balloon membranes and wooden spoons, taught them to feel vibration by resting palms on tabletops, taught them to recognize rhythm not by sound but by the tremble of air and the pressure in the chest. Eli lit up like a bonfire. Leah clapped out of sync but smiled the whole way. Myra wept the first time she held a note in her hands. Noah, meanwhile, watched them with the eyes of someone who had once believed he was alone. That afternoon he asked Mavis something he had never dared before. He held up his notebook. "You were someone before all this, weren't you?" Mavis tilted her head before. He nodded, then handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a printout from the city archives. A faded, pixelated photograph from 1982. The National Youth Choir. 50 children in white shirts standing beneath a banner, and in the center a younger Mavis Laney, baton in hand, eyes ablaze. He had found it himself. She laughed, breathless, as if something deep inside her had just been proven real again. She hadn't seen that photo in decades. She thought it had been lost after her husband's death, buried in a box or tossed in some spring cleaning madness. But Noah had dug it out from the void of public memory. She held the paper to her chest, looked at him, then whispered, "I was a conductor, before they told me to be quiet." He smiled. She saw it in his eyes. Over the next few weekends, the attic became a sanctuary, a cocoon of rhythm and movement and untamed joy. The children would arrive before the sun hit the windows and leave before the air got too heavy with the scent of returning privilege, essential oils, and protein shakes and selfishness. They learned pitch by touching wires. They learned tempo with heartbeat monitors. They learned harmony by dancing in silence. Mavis took notes after every session, tracked what worked, what didn't, adjusted, refined, built a curriculum without knowing she was building a revolution. She called it the Tactile Choir. One Saturday, as they packed up early, Myra turned to her and signed, clumsily but sincerely, "Can we come back forever?" Mavis didn't answer with words. She opened the hidden drawer in her desk and pulled out a stack of blank sheet music, one for each of them. She handed it over with a smile that nearly broke her. Outside the attic, the house remained a shrine to surface living. Howard's new meditation room smelled like sandalwood and sterilized ego. Celia spent hours perfecting Instagram reels about minimalist motherhood and cutting out toxic people. They had no idea that above them a rebellion of joy was unfolding. They had no idea the house wasn't just a house anymore. It was becoming something else. A school, a stage, a symphony in waiting, and every note began in the silence they thought they'd sentenced her to. But Mavis knew better. Silence, she had discovered, was not absence. It was canvas, and she was painting again. The rain began on a Tuesday. Not a heavy storm, just that persistent, steady kind that slides down window panes like secrets trying to escape. Howard noticed it first, not the weather. The glitch. He was in his home office, formerly Mavis's old teaching studio, reviewing security footage from the front porch, when something odd caught his eye. At 10:03 a.m. the previous Saturday, the motion sensor had activated. Not once, but 3 separate times. But when he scrubbed through the feed, the camera showed only an empty walkway, a flicker of shadow. Then nothing. Probably a squirrel, he muttered, but his tone was uncertain. He ran a system diagnostic. The log showed that the attic sensor one he'd installed months ago but never connected to a live stream had been manually disabled, 4 weekends in a row. Howard blinked. Someone had been going up there, repeatedly, without his knowledge. He called Celia. When she arrived 20 minutes later, holding her yoga mat and half a green smoothie, he greeted her not with a kiss, but a question. "Did you disable the attic sensor?" She frowned. "What no? Why would I go up there? It's like a toaster oven in the summer." Howard didn't laugh. Instead, he motioned toward his screen. "Then who the hell has been—" That night, Celia wandered through the house, annoyed more than worried. Howard always overreacted, always chasing ghosts through wiring. But when she stepped into the kitchen and pulled out the drawer where she kept junk mail, she found it a white envelope tucked beneath expired coupons. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a thank you card. Handwritten, messy, childish. "Thank you, Mrs. Laney, for helping Myra feel the music. She hasn't smiled like this in months." Her mom. Celia's stomach twisted. She reread it 3 times like it might become someone else's handwriting if she stared long enough. It didn't. It only grew louder. By morning, the storm outside had moved into the house. She stormed into Mavis's attic, phone in hand, face like thunder. "What the hell is this, Mom?" Mavis didn't flinch. She was kneeling beside the makeshift drum circle, wiping down tambourines. Behind her, a drying rack held damp worksheets covered in dots and vibrations and scribbled joy. Celia held the card up like it was evidence at a crime scene. "You're inviting children into our home, into this attic without telling anyone." Mavis stood. "They aren't just children, they're students, and this is a classroom." Howard appeared behind her. "Not anymore, you're done." He didn't yell, he didn't need to. He already had a plan. "We're bringing in a lawyer," he said, "to start the paperwork, medical guardianship, transfer of deed. You've made it clear you're not stable enough to manage a property or your own care." Mavis blinked. "You're what?" "You'll be moved to a private care facility. One with access to music therapy," Howard added with a smile that made her want to shatter something. "You'll like it." Celia crossed her arms. "This is for the best. You've been confused lately, forgetting things, playing music for deaf kids." Howard scoffed. "Mom, that's not inspiring. It's delusional." Mavis didn't speak, not until they turned their backs to walk out. Then she said, calm cutting, "Greta will have something to say about this." They paused. Howard turned. "Who?" Mavis smiled. "My attorney." 2 hours later, the storm broke for real inside the living room, where Greta Harlan stood in a gray suit that matched the clouds and laid out the folders on the coffee table like she was setting traps. "You were planning to have your mother sign medical proxy documents, correct?" she asked Howard. He shrugged. "We were exploring it. She's been acting irrationally." Greta nodded. "Did you obtain a court-ordered psychological evaluation?" He blinked. "No, but I'm a doctor." "You're a cardiologist," she cut in. "Not a psychiatrist. And what you attempted to have her sign—" She held up a copy. "This version is invalid under state law. It has no witness signature, no notary stamp, and contains language that suggests coercion." Celia shifted uneasily. Greta continued. "Furthermore, I have documentation from 2 separate physicians confirming that Mrs. Mavis Laney is of sound mind, cognitively sharp, and in full control of her legal faculties." Mavis said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence now echoed like a gavel. Howard turned to Celia, voice low. "Did you know she had a lawyer?" Celia didn't respond. Greta opened the next folder. "Additionally, per county records, the house remains in Mrs. Laney's name. Sole ownership. No shared deed. No mortgage cosign. This is her legal residence." "Wait," Celia snapped. "But we paid for renovations." "And she paid the down payment in 1994, Greta countered. "I have the bank records." Outside, thunder rolled. Greta stood. "I suggest going forward any further legal steps taken regarding Mrs. Laney's assets or residence be discussed in her presence with her legal representation present." Howard speechless. Celia blinking fast. Mavis breathing again. She looked at her daughter. "You can't sell what isn't yours. And you can't silence what was born to sing." No one moved. Greta packed her folders. Mavis turned away first, walking slowly back toward the stairs, the attic, the air that finally felt like hers again. Behind her, Howard said something under his breath, something about ungrateful and after all we've done. But Mavis didn't respond. She had music class to prepare, and the storm let it rain, because some things grow best in water. The power had gone out just before sunset, a short circuit maybe, or perhaps a flicker of fate. Mavis lit the candles slowly, one by one, as if she were preparing for a concert, not a confrontation. Their flames flickered along the walls of the attic, now fully transformed, no longer a stifling prison, but a sanctuary. Shelves of percussive tools, drawings from Noah and his friends, sheet music printed in Braille, a large whiteboard titled Community Music Trust Vision Mission Future. She sat calmly at the old writing desk, her back straight, hands folded over a single envelope. Downstairs, the front door slammed. Celia's voice cracked like a whip. "Where is she?" Howard followed behind, already red in the face. "Mom," Celia shouted, taking the stairs two at a time. Mavis didn't rise. They burst into the attic like wind and thunder. "This is a joke, right?" Howard barked, waving a paper in the air. "A charity owns the house now, a music fund for deaf kids." Mavis blinked once. "Not a joke." Celia's voice trembled. "You transferred the deed?" Mavis nodded. "This morning." Greta finalized it at 10:15 a.m. Howard scoffed, pacing. "You senile old—" "I'm not senile," Mavis said, cool and razor-sharp. "I'm sovereign." The room fell silent, save for the soft crackling of wax. Celia sat slowly in the chair across from her. "Why? Why would you do this?" "I didn't do it to you," Mavis said. "I did it for something." Howard turned on her. "This house was going to fund our retirement. It was our safety net." "No," Mavis corrected. "It was my house, and it was never a safety net. It was a cage you tried to hang me in." Celia buried her face in her hands. Howard fumed, but Mavis raised a hand, calm. "You want to talk betrayal," she said, leaning forward. "Let's talk about betrayal. You remodeled this house and stuck me under a tin roof. You planned to ship me away like expired furniture. You recorded me without consent. And now you're angry I gave my home to children who only wanted to feel music." Celia looked up, eyes shining. "You never let me in. You were always closer to your students than your own daughter. I felt like the outsider." Mavis's eyes softened. "Because you ran from the music, Celia. You resented what it took from me, never realizing it was the only thing that kept me whole." "You never said that. You never asked." Howard threw up his hands. "This is ridiculous. We can challenge the transfer, undue influence, mental fragility." "You can try," Mavis said, "but you'll lose. And I'll counter with audio recordings, legal witnesses, and years of documentation proving both mental competence and your intentions." He glared at her. "This is revenge. That's all this is." Mavis stood. "No," she said. "This is restoration. I am not taking anything from you. I am returning something to the place it belongs." She moved toward the window where candlelight met soft rain. "I gave 35 years of my life teaching music. Then I gave 15 more raising your children. And when I asked for space, you gave me silence. When I asked for connection, you gave me confinement. The attic. That was your idea of love." Celia stood quiet. "I didn't know it hurt you that much," she whispered. "You didn't want to know," Mavis said, "because then you'd have to face what you were becoming." Howard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Mavis walked back to the desk and lifted the envelope. "This is the official declaration," she said. "The house from this day forward is property of the Community Music Fund for the Hearing Impaired. Its mission is clear, its accounts are active, and as long as I live, I'll run the program from here." Celia stepped back, stunned. "And when I'm gone," Mavis added, "Noah and his peers will inherit something they were never supposed to have a space to belong." "You could have just told us," Celia said softly. "You would have stopped me." The candles cast long shadows. Howard's face collapsed into frustration, into confusion, into the slow burn of pride cracking. "I was going to give you the front office," he muttered. Mavis almost smiled. "You gave me a room without a window, a corner where sound died." Then she looked at her daughter again. Not with hatred, but with history. "I'm not punishing you, Celia," she said. "I'm healing what you never let me touch." Tears formed in Celia's eyes. "It feels like punishment." "No," Mavis said gently. "It's the song you refused to sing." A knock sounded from downstairs. Noah's voice called softly, "Mrs. Laney, we're here." She turned. "Time to go." As she walked toward the stairs, Celia stepped aside. She didn't speak, but her eyes held something regret, perhaps, or memory. Howard didn't follow. He stood there, hands on hips, fuming in the flickering dark. Mavis descended the stairs slowly. Below, Noah waited with 2 other children. Each carried a folder. One wore earmuffs, the other carried a metronome. Noah held a single sunflower in one hand and a question in the other. "Can we start early today?" Mavis smiled. "We already have." Behind her upstairs, candlelight glowed. Below, under the low-hung ceiling, the piano lid opened, and for the first time that day the house stopped being a battleground. It became a song. The sound of typing filled the room. Greta's office in downtown Charleston, neat and efficient. A half-empty coffee mug sat on her desk as she leaned back, watching the morning news flicker on the tiny flat-screen television in the corner. And in today's spotlight story, the tin roof dream. What began as a forgotten attic space in a suburban neighborhood has now become a statewide symbol of inclusion, music, and second chances. Greta smirked. They finally caught on. The reporter's voice continued as the screen cut to images, kids tapping rhythms on tabletops, Mavis clapping gently along her fingers, guiding hands to feel vibrations. The makeshift classroom under the aluminum roof had become a movement. A voiceover declared former music educator Mavis Laney, 71, transformed her own living quarters into a free music studio for hearing-impaired children. Her story and her quiet revolution are now being called the Tin Roof Dream. Back at the house, the doorbell rang constantly. Parents waited in line. Some brought their children shyly, nervously, unsure if this was real. Others came with tears in their eyes, like someone had finally opened a door they thought would never exist. Mavis stood by the threshold, calm and warm. Her clipboard, filled with names and ages, grew longer by the hour. Each child was different. Some with cochlear implants, some with only partial hearing, some with nothing at all but hands eager to move and eyes full of hunger. She greeted each one with the same line, "Can you feel that?" That's music. It doesn't need ears to enter. The city paper's headline screamed across stands, "Tin Roof, True Sound," the woman who heard what others ignored. That evening when Noah arrived, he handed her a folded note. "Mavis, you made the world open up." She tucked it between her sheet music near the place where she once hid her prescriptions, meds for sleep, for stress, for forgetting. She didn't need them anymore. Across town, Howard sat in a sterile legal office, sweat at his temple. His lawyer paced behind him, frustrated. "They've issued an audit, not just for the clinic. They're looking into the accounts you listed under your mother-in-law's name." Howard muttered, "They can't prove intent." "They don't need to," the lawyer snapped. "They have audio recordings, a legal transfer of assets, and a witness from your own security company." Howard clenched his jaw, and the lawyer added coldly, "Greta Harlan is now on the board of the South Carolina Elder Rights Coalition. That means every call you made, every document you drafted without full consent is under a microscope." Howard stood up. "This is revenge." "No," the lawyer corrected. "This is justice." The next morning, Celia was gone. No note, no message, no slammed door this time. Just a photo left at the foot of Mavis's piano. It was old, sun-bleached, torn at the edges. A snapshot from 1989 Mavis in her choir robes, smiling, standing behind a young Celia in a pink recital dress, both of them caught mid-laugh. On the back, in Celia's careful looping handwriting, "I'm sorry I never sang with you. Maybe one day I'll learn the words." Mavis stared at the photo for a long while. She didn't cry. Instead, she placed it above the music stand, framed it, and underneath she scribbled a new caption. "Forgiveness is a quieter note, but it always lingers longer." Later that week, a TV crew arrived. They wanted to film a segment inside the class. She hesitated at first, but Noah nudged her. "Let them hear it," he signed, "even if they only use their eyes." The camera captured it, all the rhythm lessons using water glasses, the silent choir practicing hand signals, the chalkboard that read "Vibration is memory." The journalist knelt beside Mavis after filming and whispered, "You gave us back something we forgot mattered." "I didn't give it back," Mavis replied. "I just refused to let it be taken." When the segment aired nationally, donations poured in. People sent letters. One woman wrote from Michigan, "My daughter cried when she saw Noah play. She didn't know kids like her could belong anywhere." Another said, "I used to teach. I quit when I lost my hearing. Thank you for showing me I still can." The dream under the tin roof was no longer just Mavis's. It had become a symphony of second chances. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mavis sat alone again by the piano. She played slowly, not for show, not for healing, but simply because her fingers remembered, and because silence no longer frightened her. Outside, kids laughed. Inside, echoes lived. And beneath the roof that once tried to mute her music bloomed louder than ever. It began just before dusk. A warm breeze whispered through the elm trees surrounding the house, rustling the leaves like nature was tuning its own orchestra. 1,000 hues of golden light washed over the neighborhood. Outside Mavis Laney's home, the yard was no longer quiet. Rows of white folding chairs filled the garden, nearly everyone occupied. Parents, reporters, neighbors who'd once walked by the house without ever glancing in. Now they craned their necks, eager for a glimpse into what had bloomed behind its modest fence. The news van parked half on the curb. A cameraman struggled to set the correct white balance as beams of light danced through wind chimes. Kids in white shirts and navy trousers stood in formation, nervously fidgeting. Some tapped their hands in rhythm on their thighs. Others watched Mavis standing at the edge of the small makeshift stage, a platform made of plywood and love. Mavis wore a deep blue dress, modest with silver pins that shimmered in the light like quiet stars. She held no baton. She didn't need one. Instead, she raised her hands, open-palmed eyes scanning each child's face. Every child nodded once confirmation. They saw her. They trusted her. Behind them stood a row of light panels. Each was carefully programmed by Noah and the volunteers. These would be the metronome tonight, their rhythm, their pulse. Greta stood just behind the crowd, hand over her heart. A tear traced down her cheek. The lights dimmed. Quiet fell like a blanket. And then, the first flicker. Green, blue, red. The children began. No instruments, no sound. Just movement, timed, graceful, breathtaking. They weren't playing music in the traditional sense. They were becoming it. Their hands moved like waves across a silent sea. Their fingers traced melodies into the air. Each color shift marked a beat. Their eyes followed the pulses, and their bodies translated that into expression. The audience sat frozen, mouths parted, eyes wide. And then a moment Mavis had waited for. She turned slowly, stepped aside, and there he was, Noah, dressed simply, his shirt tucked in sleeves rolled up. In his hands, a polished wooden flute. A gift from one of the parents whose child had found joy again in music class. But this wasn't just an instrument. It was a torch, a memory. He looked to Mavis. She nodded once. He began. The notes were hesitant at first, as though remembering a path once walked in darkness. Then stronger, confident. It was the same melody she had played that first night alone under the tin roof, unaware anyone had ever heard. But Noah had. And now he played it back to her, not as a student to a teacher, but as an equal offering, a tribute. The camera caught it all the way. Mavis closed her eyes as the melody rose, the way some in the crowd reached for each other's hands without speaking. Above, a drone hovered, filming from high. The shot caught the rooftop, rusty dented, but now painted with murals, hands, notes, stars, and a phrase in wide white letters. "We hear with our hearts." As the camera lowered, it revealed the entire garden, dozens of children moving in synchronized motion, light panels blinking in harmony, a grandmother guiding a choir of those who couldn't hear with their ears, but whose spirits resonated like bells. Near the back, a man in a navy suit stepped quietly out of a black car, Dr. Howard. He had not been invited. He did not walk to the front. He stayed in the shadows. He watched the stage, his jaw clenched. Something trembled in his eyes, regret perhaps, or realization, the weight of a moment too large to deny. Celia was not with him. On the far edge of the crowd, a woman leaned against the fence post, sunglasses hiding her face. She clutched a duffel bag as though she hadn't slept much, but she stood still, watching. The children reached their final note, hands held in stillness, as the light panels faded from gold to soft white. The silence was not awkward. It was sacred. Then the applause began. Not loud, but persistent. People stood clapping slowly, many wiping tears from their faces. One reporter didn't bother writing notes anymore. She just watched her pen forgotten in her lap. Mavis lowered her hands. She looked at the children. She smiled not with pride but with reverence. And then, breaking protocol, Noah turned and hugged her. The crowd burst into laughter and more applause. Later, as guests mingled and families exchanged stories, a local choir director approached Mavis. "What you've done here," she said, "this changes everything." "It doesn't change everything," Mavis replied, still holding Noah's hand. "It just reminds us what's always been possible." The mayor's assistant handed her a letter of formal request to expand the program across the county. State funding, volunteers, a mobile unit for children in rural schools. "You started a movement," she said. "No," Mavis said, looking to the children gathering around her. They did. As the sun set fully and lanterns lit the yard, Mavis climbed the narrow ladder to the rooftop. Noah followed. They sat side by side on the edge, legs dangling, looking down at the garden below. Laughter rose. Music played softly now from a speaker recordings of earlier rehearsals. "You know," Mavis said, "this roof used to be a prison." Noah signed, "Now it's a stage." She nodded, "Yes, and tomorrow it becomes a bridge." From far below, someone pointed up, drawing attention. A final photo was taken, Noah and Mavis on the rooftop, silhouetted against the last orange light of day. The tin roof dream had become a symphony, and the world for once was listening. The package arrived in plain brown paper, no return address. Just the lawyer's stamp in the corner, like an official whisper. Mavis sat by the windowsill, the sun soft and low, casting golden slats across the floorboards that still held faint vibrations from the morning's lesson. Children's laughter echoed distantly from the garden. But the house, now a sanctuary of sound and silence, quieted as her fingers pulled gently at the string around the box. Inside, wrapped in pale linen, was a wooden music box she hadn't seen in decades. Her hands trembled not from age, but memory. The lid was etched with clumsy carvings, a tree, a bird, a name once carved by Celia when she was 10. And nestled within the box, folded in two, was a letter. She hesitated before opening it. Something about the weight of forgiveness made her chest ache. Then slowly she unfolded the paper. "Dear Mom." It began in handwriting she hadn't seen in years. "You may never forgive me. Maybe you shouldn't. But I wanted you to know what you did. Changed me. And though I ran away, I carry what you taught me. Every note, every silence. Thank you for the last lesson." The paper trembled in her grip. Mavis folded the letter with care and placed it gently back inside the music box. She let it sit on her lap for a moment, her fingers running along its worn edges. The sun had shifted its rays now, bouncing off the aluminum roofing and casting streaks of gold into the quiet room. Outside, the sounds of practice from the children in the backyard rose and fell, like the tide drums played with palms, violins held against small shoulders, feet tapping out rhythms in the grass. She stood slowly and walked toward the open window. From there she could see the full garden families chatting under the banner that read, "Tin Roof Music Academy," chairs filled with community members who once thought the house was just another forgotten lot. What they now saw was something sacred, something born not from pity, but from defiance. A small stage had been set. Noah stood at the center, the sunlight bouncing off the metal keys of his vibraphone. He looked toward the house, toward her, and though he couldn't hear the world's noise, he could feel her heart in every vibration he was about to play. With one confident motion, Mavis walked down the hall. Her fingers brushed the wooden frames of photos she'd recently hung, images of the children smiling during rehearsals, her own face caught mid-laugh. The once empty walls were now a timeline of reclamation. She stepped into the garden just as the crowd quieted. A gentle hush, then applause broke out when they saw her. Mavis raised her hand not to silence them, but to thank them. Then, with a wave to Noah, she took her place behind the podium. The children formed a semicircle around her, each holding their own version of an instrument most adapted for tactile resonance and visual cues. LED strips lit up behind them, flickering to match the beat. They were ready. She took a deep breath, and then the music began. It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive. The children played with their whole bodies, following light touch and the memory of movement. Noah's solo emerged gently in the middle, a slow and delicate melody that mirrored the very first song Mavis had played the night he heard her. It was hauntingly beautiful. The camera, as if telling its own story, pulled slowly upward, rising from the back of the crowd, over the blooming garden, past the refurbished classroom windows up to the tin roof. The same tin that once trapped heat and silenced dreams now gleamed like a badge of resilience in the sun. The final chord lingered, and in that moment the air itself seemed to pause. Then an eruption of applause, not thunderous but heartfelt. From hands, from feet, from tapping sticks and clapping palms, a language of celebration beyond words. Later, as dusk began to fall, Mavis sat alone on the porch steps, the music box in her lap again. The wind brushed through the vines curling along the walls, carrying with it laughter and the rustling of leaves. She opened the lid once more. The soft tune played a lullaby she hadn't heard in years. Her fingers traced the carvings again. Beside the box was Celia's photo, the one left behind. A young girl in a school uniform missing a tooth holding a daffodil. On the back, in a newer hand, were 4 words, "I'm still your daughter." Mavis didn't cry. Instead, she closed the music box and looked out at the horizon. A student inside struck a triangle. Another strummed the chords to begin again. This time she just listened. And as the camera panned out wide and slow, capturing the house, the community, the children, the roof under twilight, the voice of Mavis echoed softly. "They thought I couldn't hear, but I found the music where no one else remembered to listen." Fade out. The screen turned black. Then credits rolled over, a quiet recording, the children practicing, giggling, retuning, beginning again. In the background, the metallic hum of the roof catching a whisper of rain. But this time no one closed the window.